Welcome to our deep dive into C.S. Lewis' Reflections on the Psalms. Through his insightful observations, Lewis explores how these ancient texts reveal raw emotion, ancient struggles, and timeless spirituality. Join us as we uncover the powerful, often surprising ways that these ancient words still resonate today, reminding us of both the alien and familiar in our own lives. If you're passionate about understanding literature, history, and faith, please support us by subscribing and sharing this journey with others.
'28. The Psalms. Probably written shortly before Reflections on the Psalms, 1958, this two-part essay is now in Christian Reflections, 1991. 1. The dominant impression I get from reading the Psalms is one of antiquity. I seem to be looking into a deep pit of time, but looking through a lens which brings the figures who inhabit that depth up close to my eye. In that momentary proximity, they are almost shockingly alien, creatures of unrestrained emotion, wallowing in self-pity, sobbing, cursing, screaming in exultation, clashing uncouth weapons, or dancing to the din of strange musical instruments. Yet, side by side with this, there is also a different image in my mind. Anglican choirs, well-laundered surplices, soapy boys' faces, hassocks, an organ, prayer books, and perhaps the smell of new-mown graveyard grass coming in with the sunlight through an open door. Sometimes the one, sometimes the other impression grows faint, but neither, perhaps, ever quite disappears. The irony reaches its height when a boy soloist sings in that treble, which is so beautifully free from all personal emotions, the words whereby ancient warriors lash themselves with frenzy against their enemies, and does this in the service of the God of love, and himself, meanwhile, perhaps thinks neither of that God nor of ancient wars, but of bullseyes and the comics. This irony, this double or treble vision, is part of the pleasure. I begin to suspect that it is part of the profit, too. How old the Psalms, as we now have them, really are, is a question for the scholars. I am told there is one, 18, which might really have come down from the age of David himself, that is, from the 10th century BC. Most of them, however, are said to be post-exilic. The book was put together when the Hebrews, long exiled in Babylonia, were repatriated by that enlightened ruler Cyrus of Persia. This would bring us down to the 6th century. How much earlier material the book took in is uncertain. Perhaps for our present purpose it does not greatly matter. The whole spirit and technique and the characteristic attitudes in the Psalms we have might be very like those of much older sacred poetry which is now lost. We know that they had such poetry. They must have been already famous for that art when their Babylonian conquerors asked them for a specimen. And some very early pieces occur elsewhere in the Old Testament. Deborah's song of triumph over Sisera in Judges 5 might be as old as the battle that gave rise to it back in the 13th century. If the Hebrews were conservative in such matters, then 6th century poems may be very like those of their ancestors. And we know they were conservative. One can see that by leaping forward 6 centuries into the New Testament and reading the Magnificat. The Virgin has something other and more momentous to say than the old psalmists, but what she utters is quite unmistakably a psalm. The style, the dwelling on covenant, the delight in the vindication of the poor are all perfectly true to the old model. So might the old model have been true to one yet older. For poetry of that sort did not, like ours, seek to express those things in which individuals differ, and did not aim at novelty. Even if the Psalms we read were all composed as late as the 6th century BC, in reading them I suspect that we have our hands on the near end of a living cord that stretches far back into the past. In most moods, the spirit of the Psalms feels to me more alien than that of the oldest Greek literature. But that is not an affair of dates. Distance in temper does not always coincide with distance in time. To most of us, perhaps to all of us at most times, unless we are either very uneducated or very holy, or, as might be, both, the civilization that descends from Greece and Rome is closer, more congenial, than what we inherit from ancient Israel. The very words and concepts which we use for science, philosophy, criticism, government, grammar, are all Greco-Roman. It is this, and not Israel, that has made us, in the ordinary sense, civilized. But no Christian can read the Bible without discovering that these ancient Hebrews, generally so remote, may at any moment turn out to be our brothers in a sense in which no Greek or Roman ever was. What a dull, remote thing, for example, the book of Proverbs seems at first glance. Bearded Orientals uttering endless platitudes as if in a parody of the Arabian Nights. Compared with Plato or Aristotle, compared even with Xenophon, it is not thought at all. Then suddenly, just as you are going to give it up, your eye falls on the words, "If thine enemy be hungry, give him bread to eat, and if he be thirsty, give him water to drink." Proverbs chapter 25, verse 21. One rubs one's eyes. So they were saying that already. They knew that so long before Christ came. There is nothing like it in Greek, nor, if my memory serves me, in Confucius. And this is the sort of surprise we shall often get in the Psalms. These strange, alien figures may at any moment show that, in spiritual descent, as opposed to cultural, it is they, after all, who are our ancestors, and the classical nations who are alien. Conversely, in reading the classics, we sometimes have the opposite surprise. Those loved authors, so civilized, tolerant, humane, and enlightened, every now and then reveal that they are divided from us by a gulf. Hence the eternal roguish tittering about pederasty in Plato, or the hard pride that makes Aristotle's ethics in places almost comic. We begin to doubt whether any one of them, even Virgil himself, if we could recall him from the dead, might not, in the first hour's conversation, let out something that would utterly estrange us. I do not at all mean that the Hebrews were just better than the Greeks and the Romans. On the contrary, we shall find in the Psalms expressions of a cruelty more vindictive and a self-righteousness more complete than anything in the classics. If we ignore such passages and read only a few selected favourite psalms, we miss the point. For the point is precisely this, that these same fanatic and homicidal Hebrews, and not the more enlightened peoples, again and again, for brief moments, reach a Christian level of spirituality. It is not that they are better or worse than the pagans, but that they are both better and worse. One is forced to recognize that, in one respect, these alien poets are our predecessors, and the only predecessors we can find in all antiquity. They have something the pagans have not. They know something of which Socrates was ignorant. This something does not seem to us to arise at all naturally from what else we can see of their character. It looks like something that has been given them from outside. In fact, like what it professes to be, a revelation. Their claim to be the chosen people is strong. We may, indeed, be surprised at the choice. If we had been allowed to see the world as it was, say, in the 15th century BC, and asked to guess which of the stocks then existing was going to be entrusted with the consciousness of God, and with the transmission of that blood which would one day produce a body for the incarnation of God himself, I do not think many of us would have guessed right. I think the Egyptians would have been my own favourite. A similar strangeness meets us elsewhere. The raw material out of which a thing is made is not always that which would seem most promising to one who does not understand the process. There is nothing hard, brittle, or transparent about the ingredients of glass. Again, to come nearer to the present matter, do not our own personal ancestors, our family, seem at first rather improbable? Later, as we begin to recognize the heredity that works in us, we understand. But surely not at first. What young man feels, these are exactly the sort of people whose son, or grandson, or descendant I might be expected to be. For usually, in early life, the people with whom one seems to have most in common, the people who share one's interests, the men of one's own totem, are not one's relatives. So the idea of having been born into the wrong family is an attractive myth. We are delighted when the hero, in Siegfried, forces the dwarf to confess that he is not his son. The thing one is made out of is not necessarily like oneself, still less like one's idea of that self, and looks at first even more unlike than it really is. It may be so with the origins of our species. The evolutionists say we descend from anthropoids, creatures akin to apes. Is it, at first sight, the descent we would have chosen? If an intelligence such as ours had looked at the pre-human world and been told that one of the species then in existence was to be raised to rational and spiritual status and at last to behold its creator face to face, would he have picked the winner? Not unless it realized the importance of its hand-like paws, just as one would not guess the ingredients of glass unless one knew some chemistry. So we, because of something we do not know, are bewildered to find the ancient Hebrews chosen as they were. From this point of view, there is no better psalm to begin with than number 109. It ends with a verse which every Christian can at once make his own. The Lord is the prisoner's friend, standing by the poor or friendless to save him from unjust judges. This is one of the characteristic notes of the Psalms, and one of the things for which we love them. It anticipates the temper of the Magnificat. It is hardly to be paralleled in pagan literature. The Greek gods were very active in casting down the proud, but hardly in raising the humble. It will commend itself even to a modern unbeliever of goodwill. He may call it wishful thinking, but he will respect the wish. In a word, if we read only the last verse, we should feel in full sympathy with this psalmist. But the moment we look back at what precedes that verse, he turns out to be removed from us by infinite distances, or worse still, to be loathsomely akin to that in us which is the main business of life to purge away. Psalm 109 is as unabashed a hymn of hate as was ever written. The poet has a detailed program for his enemy which he hopes God will carry out. The enemy is to be placed under a wicked ruler. He is to have an accuser perpetually at his side, whether an evil spirit, a Satan as our prayer book version renders it, or merely a human accuser, a spy, an agent provocateur, a member of the secret police, verse 5. If the enemy attempts to have any religious life, this, far from improving his position, must make him even worse. Let his prayer be turned into sin, verse 6. And after his death, which had better please be early, verse 7, his widow and children and descendants are to live in unrelieved misery, verses 8 to 12. What makes our blood run cold, even more than the unrestrained vindictiveness, is the writer's untroubled conscience. He has no qualms, scruples, or reservations, no shame. He gives hatred free rein, encourages and spurs it on, in a sort of ghastly innocence. He offers these feelings just as they are to God, never doubting that they will be acceptable, turning straight from the maledictions to, "Deal thou with me, O Lord God, according to thy name, for sweet is thy mercy." Verse 20. The man himself, of course, lived very long ago. His injuries may have been, humanly speaking, beyond endurance. He was, doubtless, a hot-blooded barbarian, more like a modern child than a modern man. And though we believe, and can even see from the last verse, that some knowledge of the real God had come to his race, yet he lived in the cold of the year, the early spring of revelation, and those first gleams of knowledge were like snowdrops exposed to the frosts. For him, then, there may have been excuses. But we, what good can we find in reading such stuff? One good, certainly. We have here an uninhibited expression of those feelings which oppression and injustice naturally produce. The psalm is a portrait. Under it should be written, "This is what you make of a man by ill-treating him." In a modern child or savage, the results might be exactly the same. In a modern Western European adult, especially if he were a professing Christian, they would be more sophisticated, disguised as a disinterested love of justice, claiming to be concerned with the good of society. But under that disguise, and none the better for it in the sight of God, the feelings might still be there. I am thinking of a total stranger who forwarded to me a letter written to her in denigration of myself by another total stranger, because, as she said, she felt it her duty. And now, in a case of what we ordinarily call seduction, that is, sexual seduction, we should think it monstrous to dwell on the guilt of the party who yielded to temptation and ignore that of the party who tempted. But every injury or oppression is equally a temptation to hatred, and in that sense a seduction. Whenever we have wronged our fellow man, we have tempted him to be such a man as wrote Psalm 109. We may have repented of our wrong. We do not always know if he has repented of his hatred. How do accounts now stand between us if he has not? I do not know the answer to that question, but I am inclined to think that we had better look unflinchingly at the sort of work we have done. Like puppies, we must have our noses rubbed in it. A man, now penitent, who has once seduced and abandoned a girl and then lost sight of her, had better not avert his eyes from the crude realities of the life she may now be living. For the same reason, we ought to read the Psalms that curse the oppressor, read them with fear. Who knows what imprecations of the same sort have been uttered against ourselves? What prayers have red men and black and brown and yellow sent up against us to their gods, or sometimes to God himself? All over the earth the white man's offence smells to heaven. Massacres, broken treaties, theft, kidnappings, enslavement, deportation, floggings, lynchings, beatings up, rape, insult, mockery, and odious hypocrisy make up that smell. But the thing comes nearer than that. Those of us who have little authority, who have few people at our mercy, may be thankful. But how if one is an officer in the army, or perhaps worse, an NCO, a hospital matron, a magistrate, a prison warden, a school prefect, a trade union official, a boss of any sort? In a word, anyone who cannot be answered back. It is hard enough, even with the best will in the world, to be just. It is hard, under the pressure of haste, uneasiness, ill temper, self-complacency, and conceit, even to continue intending justice. Power corrupts. The insolence of office will creep in. We see it so clearly in our superiors. Is it unlikely that our inferiors see it in us? How many of those who have been over us did not sometimes, perhaps often, need our forgiveness? Be sure that we likewise need the forgiveness of those that are under us. We may not always receive it. They may not be Christians at all. They may not be far enough on the way to master that hard work of forgiveness which we have set them. Bitter chronic resentment, unsuccessfully resisted or not resisted at all, may be burning against us. The spirit, essentially, of Psalm 109. I do not mean that God hears and will grant such prayers as that psalmist uttered. They are wicked. He condemns them. All resentment is sin. And we may hope that those things which our inferiors resent were not really half so bad as they imagine. The snub was unintentional. The high-handed behavior on the bench was due to ignorance and an uneasy awareness of one's own incapacity. The seemingly unfair distribution of work was not really unfair, or not intended to be. The inexplicable personal dislike for one particular inferior, so obvious to him and to some of his fellows, is something of which we are genuinely unconscious. It appears in our conscious mind as discipline, or the need for making an example. Anyway, it is very wicked of them to hate us. Yes, but the folly consists in supposing that God sees the wickedness in them apart from the wickedness in us which provoked it. They sin by hatred because we tempted them. We have, in that sense, seduced, debauched them. They are, as it were, the mothers of this hatred. We are the fathers. It is from this point of view that the Magnificat is terrifying. If there are two things in the Bible which should make our blood run cold, it is one. The other is that phrase in Revelation, the wrath of the Lamb. If there is not mildness in the Virgin Mother, if even the Lamb, the helpless thing that bleats and has its throat cut, is not the symbol of the harmless, where shall we turn? The resemblance between the Magnificat and traditional Hebrew poetry, which I noted above, is no mere literary curiosity. There is, of course, a difference. There are no cursings here, no hatred, no self-righteousness. Instead, there is mere statement. He has scattered the proud, cast down the mighty, sent the rich empty away. I spoke just now of the ironic contrast between the fierce psalmists and the choir boy's treble. The contrast is here brought up to a higher level. Once more we have the treble voice, a girl's voice, announcing without sin that the sinful prayers of her ancestors do not remain entirely unheard. And doing this, not indeed with fierce exultation, yet, who can mistake the tone, in a calm and terrible gladness. I am tempted here to digress for a moment into a speculation which may bring ease to us in one direction while it alarms us in another. Christians are unhappily divided about the kind of honour in which the Mother of the Lord should be held. But there is one truth about which no doubt seems admissible. If we believe in the virgin birth, and if we believe in our Lord's human nature, psychological as well as physical, for it is heretical to think him a human body which had the second person of the Trinity instead of a human soul, we must also believe in a human heredity for that human nature. There is only one source for it, though in that source all the true Israel is summed up. If there is an iron element in Jesus, may we not, without irreverence, guess whence, humanly speaking, it came?